Hello guys, thank you so much for coming back to watch another video on my channel. Now if you are waiting for official news from Capcom for an upcoming Resident Evil title, I thought I'll make a list of the most scariest Resident Evil titles from the Resident Evil franchise. Now remember, this is just my list as how I felt with these Resident Evil titles, so it means it's very subjective, so your list might be different to mine, which is completely okay, so keep that in mind while you're watching this video. So without wasting any time, here's a list of the most scariest Resident Evil titles from the Resident Evil franchise. Before I start the video, as I always ask you, if you do like this content, you do like the video, do make sure to stick around by subscribing to my channel. Resident Evil 3 Remake. I know a lot of gamers out there hasn't been a big fan of Resident Evil 3 Remake with the cut content which was missing as it was originally in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. However, keeping that in mind, there's a lot of really good stuff in Resident Evil 3 Remake which make this game a truly terrifying Resident Evil experience. Resident Evil 3 Remake features a lot of new branching enemies, just like those massive Tods. We find them in the sewers areas and they can engulf you with just one bite if you don't shoot them at their weak points. Nemesis also made a presence in the game, even though it's very short-lived, just around the Raccoon streets. However, the chase and the speed of the Tyrant compared to Mr. X truly made a very terrifying experience, especially when you can't see how far Nemesis is while he's chasing you through the streets. Also, the insects we fight them across the industrial area also had a very alien sort of vibe. So yes, I think Resident Evil 3 Remake did a lot of good things, and one of them was being a scary Resident Evil title. Resident Evil 4. Now how can we forget about Resident Evil 4, how popular that game is. To some people it's still one of the best Resident Evil titles out there, and it didn't focus as much on the survival horror side of the things and it focused more on the action side of things. However, that game had a lot of scary elements in the game. Even the enemies this time around, they're not just generic zombies, they can actually communicate, they can chase you, follow you wherever you go, and you can't get away, and you have to make sure you run through and pass through them. And how can we forget about Dr. Salvador, the chainsaw guy? That was actually really terrifying because the chainsaw sound was constantly chasing you while you're trying to fight the zombies or these ganados, and at the same time it can kill you with one shot, which is actually really terrifying scene to watch. This time around, you're not dealing with a virus, you're dealing with a parasite, which actually evolves throughout the game. You see from the very start, it's there and making them into a clever zombies, but then later on when you pop the heads of these ganados, you can actually see their parasite, and further on you can see the evolution that it actually turns into these worms or these parasites which can actually chase you on its own. And how can we forget about those religious cultists, which we can see them around castle areas. They're constantly chanting while they're trying to chase you. It was actually quite terrifying experience. So Resident Evil 4 did a lot of scary things while they also keeping on the action side of things rather than the survival horror side of things. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. This was the first Resident Evil title, I would say, which properly introduced us to this stalker type enemy, because Nemesis chases you throughout the town and you don't know where you can find him. You first met him into the RPD station where you have the option to either fight or flight in that situation, but then he continues to chase you throughout the entirety of the game. While it only says one word throughout the game, stars, however that one word was quite terrifying. You constantly running away from Nemesis, you're trying to find a safe room. Also, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was a survival horror game, not as much on the action side of things, even though it was much more fast paced compared to Resident Evil 2. And however, it was still focused far too much on the item management, resource management, so you have to make sure there's a lot of backtracking. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a far superior game than the remake they done recently, so I personally think it deserves a spot into one of the most scariest Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 4 Remake. I love Resident Evil 4 Remake. For me personally, it's far more superior than Resident Evil 4. I know it's a very controversial opinion, however I personally think that this game has done the Resident Evil 4 adjusts this while keeping the same core elements. Now Resident Evil 4 Remake has elevated you over the original Resident Evil 4 with adding a lot of new features and doing a lot of improvement, and among those improvements is a scary element which was present on the original Resident Evil 4, now being increased a dial in a Resident Evil 4 Remake. If I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of segments in the game which was actually terrifying for me, and I personally felt that this game has done it really well by just showing us graphically how beautiful the graphics can look and how terrifying the lighting can work in Resident Evil 4 Remake. The sound design was massively done, and also the enemy AI has also been radically increased and improved over the original Resident Evil 4. And while we're talking about the improvement, they've done a lot of improvements in the scary elements with the characters and the enemies, and one of those is regenerators. Regenerators was a truly terrifying thing in Resident Evil 4 when it came out. However, it was very short-lived in a very short segment, and same goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake, that this time around they actually improved on the AI and how they walk, and with the mannerism where they have this blobby skin while flapping around while they're running and trying to chase you. It was actually quite terrifying to watch in the dim light area, because the game has beautiful lighting and beautiful graphics to showcase these creatures in a more modern technology. And due to the lighting and the original design of these creatures, it actually made Resident Evil 4 Remake as one of the terrifying Resident Evil titles period. Resident Evil Village. Now Resident Evil Village follows the same theme and same story of Ethan Winters from Resident Evil 7, who survived the events of the Baker Mansion. And in this game he has a brand new objective to find his daughter, which is missing in this village. Resident Evil Village had a more Metroidvania style to it, which is more like a theme park of horrors, due to which it introduces to more brand new creatures and brand new enemy types, which has a more gothic style to it. Lycans turn out to be a very terrifying experience for me, because the way they were screaming, how agile and how fast they were, and how many bullets they can take before they get down. However, that wasn't the most scariest thing in Resident Evil Village. There were some segments which were actually really terrifying. For example, in the house Benevento. It is where the game shined the most, because this time Capcom has done a bit of experiment, and that experiment actually worked in their favor, because you are running away from this creature which is like a giant fetus of a baby who's chasing you while you can't fight back, and you feel the real dread and helplessness. And it was in a very dim lit area, which actually added to this whole scene, and I think it was brilliantly done by Capcom in this game. And there's also some segments in the game which were actually really terrifying, so I think due to the gothic nature and the style they adapted in the Resident Evil Village and the scenes they've done and some of the experiments they've done, I think it deserved to be on the spot to be one of the scariest Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 1 Remake. This game was actually a remake of the original Resident Evil title. However, this game has improved and become one of the best Resident Evil titles for the franchise. The game was a massive overhaul and a massive improvement over the original game. It had the same sort of control system where you had a tank control. However, this time around you actually get to feel the Spencer Mansion. The Spencer Mansion itself was the more scary thing. It felt more like a character into the game. You had the features where you have to burn the zombies. If you don't burn them, you've later found out that they actually turn into these Crimson Heads, which are a faster version, more deadlier zombies who can chase you much faster than the original zombies you fight them in the Spencer Mansion. You also had Lisa, which is a brand new character added, and it had a very sad story behind it, but it also was very terrifying in the game, which can appear in different scenarios. And I think it was brilliantly done in this remake, which was done based on the original game, and however managed to exceed the expectation what people were expecting from this remake. It was a pure survival horror game, and the soundtrack and how the game felt, it was just classic, and I think it was one of those classic titles. If anyone asks me for the perfect Resident Evil title or any Resident Evil title they want to play, I would recommend this game to them. So I think for me, it deserved to be in the top 3 list of the most scariest Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 2 Remake. Again, in the same way, Resident Evil 2 Remake is a remake of the original Resident Evil 2 game, which is one of the best Resident Evil titles out there. However, personally, I think Resident Evil 2 Remake was done brilliantly. It was crafted masterfully. This museum, which has turned into this RPD station, actually holds many secrets, and you can actually see that. You are trying to search through the RPD station to find the keys and to progress. You're looking for these key items, while Mr. X trying to chase you. There's these lickers which feel more realistic because of the graphics, and the zombies had this dismemberment feature which was added in this game, which made it very terrifying. It also has one of the best atmosphere for a Resident Evil title. You are walking through these dim light areas where you can bar the windows or board the windows to make sure these zombies doesn't come and attack you. The game also had the backtracking element where you have to backtrack through areas where you have lickers which only can react to your sound if you make any. There's a choice there for you if you have to fight them, which could be a very tough fight for you, or you can have to just hide or run away while Mr. X is chasing you throughout the RPD station. Also, the G-embryo creatures, which you fight them later on down the sewers, they were also very terrifying and very gross in its nature. So personally for me, I think Resident Evil 2 Remake captures the perfect zombie game from any franchise if you're talking about. I think it was beautifully crafted and so much effort was put into this survival horror theme and the dreaded nature of the game. So I think Resident Evil 2 Remake deserved to be in one of the top spots of being the most scariest Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 is the most scariest Resident Evil title out of the franchise for me. I'm not saying this is the best Resident Evil title, however it's the most scariest of them all. It featured the terrifying Jack Baker, who chases you through the first hour or the first 2 hours of the game, where you have no choice to run away from him while he constantly taunting you. This was actually a really terrifying experience personally for me. Now, fair enough, you don't have much enemy type in the game, however this molded creature which was introduced instead of zombies were actually really terrifying, especially when you have to fight them in this basement area into the main house. And how can we forget about Marguerite boss fight, which was actually really terrifying and really gross at the same time. This was the game which introduced this brand new RA engine which made the game look photorealistic, but at the same time the game was terrifying for the first couple of hours of the game, and I think that was the perfect setting of any Resident Evil title, and I think they should take cues from Resident Evil 7 for the upcoming Resident Evil 9 game. The game had a lot of inspiration from the media out there, just like Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which you can feel it from the very start of the game, where you have to fight Mia into the guest house, to the main house, to the game further on, and you can feel the inspiration which actually was captured through the beautiful graphics and the whole gameplay mechanics which was introduced into the Resident Evil 7. Also, Resident Evil VR was the most terrifying experience on any VR I've played before, so if you never tried it, I think you should go and try Resident Evil 7 in VR and you would know how truly terrifying this game can be. So what do you guys think? This was just my list of the most scariest Resident Evil titles. Please do let me know and do share your list in the comment section down below in this video. So that's it for the video, guys. I'll catch you again with another video on my channel. Until then, look after yourself. Have a good one.